Great. Good morning. Thank you for watching this virtual lecture event. For those of you who are new, IWP is a graduate security, intelligence, international affairs. We have 5 master's degree programs, 18 certificates of study, and a new doctoral program. If you're interested in learning more about us, please visit iwp.edu. This morning's event is a part of the African Strategic Forum sponsored by the Institute of World Politics. I will begin by introducing our moderator for this morning, Professor Hashem Meki. Professor Meki has taught Arabic language, culture, and Middle East media at IWP since 2012. He's the owner of Bridge Language Solutions, providing an array of language translation, interpretation, and teaching services to the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, and the founder of Keeley Global, a nonprofit organization that promotes education, health, and economic empowerment in the Sudan and the Republic of South Sudan. He holds a bachelor's degree in both political science and international studies from the City College of New York and a master's of arts in strategic studies and international politics from IWP. I would like to thank our panelists for joining us this morning, and without further ado, I will hand it over to Professor Meki. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for your kind introduction. As Hannah has said, my name is Hashem Meki, and I coordinate and moderate the African Strategic Forum here at the Institute of World Politics. Thank you to our guests again for joining on Facebook, YouTube, and this webinar. The African Strategic Forum, I will say a little about it, that invites leaders, independent thinkers, and experts from broad interdisciplinary backgrounds for in-depth conversations on African key topics. Our event today is on the challenges facing Ethiopia and the way forward. For this event, we have invited very thoughtful and distinguished leaders in their own field of expertise, and we're super excited that they would help us break down the latest on the Ethiopian issue. This event, I would like to say a couple words for the co-organizers, and without their help, this event wouldn't have been possible. First, thank you so much, Ganet Nogusi, from the Ethiopian Advocacy Network and the American Civic Council. I would also like to thank Mr. Busu Falaka and Mr. Florindo Chifukute, the Executive Director of the Friends of Angola, who have co-sponsored our today's event. Without further ado, I will introduce my panelists, then we can start our discussion. Our first panelist, who is joining us from Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, is Dr. Abnek, who is an anthropologist, historian, and carries out research on the history and culture of the Near East Africa, particularly in Ethiopia. He is research professor of politics and governance in Africa, political anthropology at the African Studies Center at Leiden University in the Netherlands. So welcome, Dr. Abnek. Our second panelist is Miss Bronwyn Bruton, who is a democracy and governance specialist with extensive experience in Africa. Ms. Bruton is in 2008 to 2009 was International Affairs Fellow in Residence at the Council on Foreign Relations. Ms. Bruton has also served on a program as a program manager on the Africa team of the USAID Office of Transition Initiatives as a policy analyst on the International Affairs and Trade team of the Government Accountability Office, and a program officer at the Center for International Private Enterprise. So welcome, Ms. Bronwyn. Our third panelist is Mr. Busu Falaka, who has been human rights and democracy advocate for 18 years. Mr. Falaka serves on the board directors of Friends of Angola, pro-leadership INC, senior policy advisor at the Solidarity Movement for New Ethiopia. Busu works in various peace building initiatives and programs in the USA and in Africa as well. And he holds a Master of Science from George Mason University in conflict analysis. So welcome, Mr. Falaka. Our fourth panelist is Yusuf Badawaza, who is the Senior Regional Advisor at Freedom House, having formerly served as the Senior Program Officer for Ethiopia. Prior to joining Freedom House, he was Secretary General of Ethiopia for Human Rights Council, and that was the Ethiopia's foremost human rights organization. So welcome, Yusuf Badawaza. Our fifth panelist and last, who is joining us from Ethiopia in Addis Ababa, is Dr. Gideon Timiosos, who is the current Attorney General of Ethiopia. Dr. Gideon received his Doctor of Judicial Science in Comparative Constitutional Law in November of 2014 from Central University of Budapest, from Central European University in Budapest, Hungary. So welcome, Mr. Gideon, to the panel. So thank you so much for joining this panel, and I'm excited that we have this distinguished panelist who would lead us in the discussion. So with that, I would first let Dr. Abnek go first, provide few remarks, and then followed by Ms. Brunwyn. So please go ahead, Dr. Abnek.
Thank you, Professor Hashem. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to this interesting webinar.
You're welcome.
We are witnessing a tragic conflict in northern Ethiopia, derailing a promising course of political change started in 2018 by the new Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. At issue today, I think, are two things: the causes and nature of the armed conflict in Tigray, insofar as can be ascertained now, and secondly, the possible impact and ramifications of this conflict on political transition processes in Ethiopia. I'm aware that foreigners, Ferengis, should be cautious in commenting on Ethiopia. I make these remarks as a long-term field researcher, anthropologist, having worked mainly in the country in a variety of field sites in the past 2 decades. And when working in local level settings, I noticed some of the drawbacks, also the advantages, but also the drawbacks of ethnic federalism on the local level, generating a politicization of many things, and sometimes also really tensions. Now, when addressing point one, the war of the past months, we might start by recalling the words of the biblical prophet Hosea, who said, "For they have sown the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind." I fear that has been happening with the TPLF. They have called upon the forces of war in light of their aims to dispute the legitimacy of the federal government and to ultimately, I think, return to Addis Ababa. Their preceding fall from grace and their decline as leading party in Ethiopia was, however, generated by their own non-democratic repressive policies in the political sphere and the non-transparent favoritist ones in the economic domain. To get a clear picture of everything regarding this armed conflict is still very difficult. To really assess what has happened, we have to study the antecedents of the conflict, the wider context, and the whole picture. Let me just briefly note that from its massive military operation on 4 November, it seems clear that the TPLF bears, I think, main responsibility for the conflict. And the nature of that grisly night attack on the federal Northern Command shocked the nation. The psychological impact, the political impact was huge. Any national government, I think, would have reacted. No country can continue to exist if it allows its armed forces to be slaughtered. Interesting is that, so many of the global media were not, helping things, clearing up things. They were more or less confusing things, not doing their homework, often giving incomplete or misleading news. And almost always they bypassed Ethiopian local media sources and government statements. Well, indeed, many things have happened that were problematic, if not unacceptable, such as the, let's say, unwanted involvement of Eritrean troops, even on the account of the general of the NDF, Belay Siyum, a couple of weeks ago. It is clear that the Ethiopian army in this whole affair has shown professionalism and relative restraint. But a war or an armed conflict like this, initiated by these faulty calculations by the TPLF leadership, I think, takes its own unforeseen dynamics. So we do have needless deaths, an estimated 1.5 million people now needing food and other aid, economic disruption, breakdown of public facilities, looting, and so forth. We can talk about that later. Most important now, I think, is to stimulate a rebuilding of Tigray politically and economically. The people of Tigray obviously must have a renewed stake in the federation, under a hopefully more democratic and transparent regional government. This brings me to the second point. How will the Tigray conflagration impact on the political transition process that started under Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed? This is ultimately the most crucial issue, and we can and must have some trust in the Prime Minister. The future of the Ethiopian Federation is not disintegration, but better maintenance and repair. The parliamentary elections of upcoming June should be held, of course, and Tigray should obviously be included in them. Tigray is a full and recognized vital partner in federal Ethiopia, and in no way to be disadvantaged or denigrated. There are voices saying that this conflict threatens the current federation as a whole and makes it impossible to maintain it, and that the federal government is engaged in centralization at the cost of federation. I think this is incorrect. Prime Minister Abiy and his government have moved to limit the inordinate economic grip of the TPLF party and business elite on the national economy. That's true. But he has not been heard saying that the constitution is to be abrogated, or that the ethno-regional federation, is to be terminated. On the contrary, if there is a mandate for that after the elections, he may aim to redefine and improve it. Certainly the current federation has its problems and was not being properly implemented, certainly not until, let's say, April 2018, not even on its own constitutional principles. In general, political ethnicity, in Amharic, good day, was made into a business model in the past 27 years, a business model. That is a wrong incentive structure. It led to people creating power and jobs for themselves on the basis of ethnicity purely. It's a wrong incentive structure and very costly also, has produced local conflicts based on the territorialization of ethnicity and has subverted federal cooperation. The Tigray conflict has, of course, led to some premonitions among certain elites in other regions. But eventually, a new modus vivendi of cooperation, exchange, and synergy must and can be found. Ethiopia is to reinvent itself, preferably with new and better quality political leaders, a thorough reset of the economic dispensation, and better agreements on federal, state, and regional budgeting. If more economic fairness and integration are not achieved, political disagreements and a kind of race to the bottom will follow. Surely there is now a need to have the elections with solid party debates and deliberations across the political spectrum, and to reinforce the reform agenda commenced in April 2018. That agenda provides a unique framework still for opportunities for renewed development and democratization. The future of Ethiopia does not lie in rehearsing the past, but in overcoming it and moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abnick, for your thoughtful remarks on this. Our next panelist is Ms. Bronwyn Bruton, so please go ahead.
Dear Hashem, thank you so much for welcoming me this morning. I'm honored to join you. And I thank the Institute for World Politics for convening us to discuss what is a very important and upsetting series of developments in Ethiopia. I would like to focus my remarks on exploring a subtext of the narrative on Ethiopia, an important one, which is that the conflict in Tigray was somehow a war of choice that was initiated by the Ethiopian government as a form of vendetta. Many of us who are watching today are perhaps not very familiar with the history of the TPLF. And it is important to step back briefly and to explain that TPLF, although it was an important liberation movement which created modern Ethiopia, was also a repressive regime that held power in Ethiopia for 27 years, for almost 3 decades. It was not an elected government. It was not a democratic government. It was a government that ruled at the point of a gun. It was a government that violently suppressed secessionist movements in many parts of the country, particularly the Ogaden and the Oromo regions. It was a government that imprisoned tens of thousands of people, particularly youths. And it was a government that was responsible for torturing those individuals on a regular basis. The TPLF, at the head of its coalition, the EPRDF, was also responsible for decimating civil society, for making the work of civil society organizations largely illegal, for delegitimizing the press and suppressing all freedom of expression. It was a government that prevented Ethiopia from reaching its full potential. It was also a government that was authoritarian and not willing to surrender power. And we need to recall that one of the very special peculiarities of the situation that we find ourselves in is that the TPLF lost power through a popular uprising in March of 2018, which was remarkably peaceful and free of blood. However, because that transition was peaceful, it meant that the TPLF surrendered power without being disarmed. And so the situation that Ethiopia has found itself in over the past couple of years is, in a sense, a situation in which there are two competing military powers, one the Ethiopian government and the other the TPLF, which retreated to its northern stronghold with most of its weaponry and soldiers intact. For that reason, many of us would have predicted that conflict between these parties was inevitable. If Abiy came to power with any mandate at all in March of 2018, it was to rebalance the distribution of political, economic, and military power between Ethiopia's ethnicities. Because of its long rule, the TPLF had probably 70% or more of Ethiopia's military, political, and economic might. But it represented only 5 to 6% of Ethiopia's population. So Abiy's difficult task, which he attempted to accomplish peacefully, was to somehow persuade the TPLF to accept a proportionate amount of power, which meant dramatically reducing its power. And unfortunately, that is a situation that could not occur voluntarily. I think very few people would expect an authoritarian regime to sit back and quietly watch the decimation of its political authority. That is fundamentally what brought us to this path. And we can sit back and we can argue perhaps that Abiy should have done this or he should have done that the formation of the PP was the straw that broke the camel's back. But fundamentally, I think we need to understand as an international community that we are all culpable in the situation that Ethiopia finds itself in. The international community sat back for decades and watched as the TPLF stole money from the Ethiopian population and used budgetary support from the international community to build up an excessive pile of arms, a pile of arms that was vastly disproportionate to the population that it represented. We're now reaping the harvest of those policies, and it's incumbent on the international community to assist the government of Ethiopia in resolving this problem. At the same time, I would like to say that I feel deeply concerned and worried by the focus that we're putting on litigating the past. And I hope that we can all put this conversation behind us and focus briefly on the resolution of the conflict in the Tigray. And most particularly, we should all be joining together to urge the Ethiopian government to do everything possible to open that space, both to humanitarian actors and to the media and to human rights investigators who can perform credible and unbiased investigations of any human rights abuses or war crimes that have taken place in the North. The failure to quickly resolve this problem and to offer access to international actors is doing unimaginable and perhaps irreparable harm to relations between the Ethiopian government and its allies in the West. And there's nothing that I would like to see more coming out of this conversation than an ability to refocus our attention on dealing with that crisis quickly so that we can move our attention to even more important issues like the election, which is very quickly approaching us. And thank you for giving me the floor.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bronwyn, for this very informative presentation. Our third panelist, Mr. Falaka. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Hashem, and I would like to thank the Institute of World Politics for hosting this important event. It's a privilege to be among distinguished panelists.
Thank you.
I will focus my presentation on the 2021 Ethiopian election and the peace-building efforts that needs to be addressed by the Ethiopian government. The inter-ethnic tension and the protracted social conflict which fueled a country protest in Ethiopia reached a tipping point when the TPLF-dominated government was forced out in 2018 and ushered in a reform-minded leadership in its place. Dr. Abiy Ahmed won a parliamentary election in April 2018, dismantling the most restrictive political and economic system in Africa and paving for unrestricted access to commerce and political power for every citizen. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed inherited a country that was on the verge of collapse following 27 years of oppression under the TPLF-controlled authoritarian regime. The TPLF used ethnic federalism as a system for state formation and institutionalized exclusionary policies, resulting in unprecedented ethnic strife among the population. The tight link between ethnicity and state resources and the ethnic federal structure has created obstacles for inter-ethnic interaction and inter-regional cohesion. Relations between ethnic groups became increasingly competitive, resulting in tension and conflict as the struggle for control over state resources continued, leading to corruption and unsustainable economic disparity between the ruling elites and the population. The ethnic-based federal system created an incentive for ethnic elites to mobilize their base along ethno-nationalist lines, leaving the future of the country at a greater risk of disintegration and displacement of millions of people. The divide rule strategy adopted by TPLF ruling elites was used as a tool for holding on to power, leaving no space for democracy and an inclusive political system. Under TPLF rule, ethnic federalism has neither eradicated ethnic conflicts nor achieved democracy. Once he came to power 3 years ago, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed initiated a major political reforms. However, the TPLF ruling elites opposed any reforms proposed by the Prime Minister. Since the changes affected its ability to control state and economic power. Prime Minister Abiy took on a bold and extraordinary domestic, political, and economic reforms, paving the way towards democracy, rule of law, and sustainable development. To mention some of the key initiatives, Prime Minister Abiy released thousands of political prisoners and welcomed home exiled opposition leaders and opened the political space and a promise to hold a free and fair election. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed surprised the region by making a peace with neighboring Eritrea and promoted peace and diplomacy in the wider Horn of Africa. The government expanded media freedoms. Reconciliation and Dialogue Commission was initiated to tackle ethnic and political grievances. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed created Ministry of Peace and appointed women to half of his cabinet. An independent election board was established. Exiled former political leader and judge Burtukan Mekdessa was appointed to chair the National Board of Election. He accelerated economic reforms and pushed for privatizing some of state-owned enterprises. Last but not least, established an independent Human Rights Commission. Based on the current situation on the ground, Prime Minister Abiy needs to push for more reforms, including building democratic institutions, upholding the rule of law, securing the safety of citizens, and ensuring transparency. Giving citizens a political freedom and conducting free and fair election are critical in transitioning Ethiopia to a democratic state. When citizens freely participate in the political system and elect their leaders, the transition to a democratic state becomes viable, which will contribute to a nation building with a greater cohesion and less ethnic polarizing in the country. Having a free and fair election has never been more important in Ethiopia, considering the challenges the country is facing, and the need to have a democratically elected government with a mandate to govern the country is necessary. All the stakeholders, including the current government, political party, civil society organization, election commission, and the media have historic opportunity and a moral obligation to support a democratic transition in Ethiopia through a free and fair election. As far as peace building initiative, the newly established Ministry of Peace can design and implement a peace building initiative across the country. The Ministry of Peace should facilitate conflict resolution dialogues between ethnic groups, political party, and expand human rights and legal advisory council across all the region to carry out a peace building programs in Ethiopia. The Ministry of Peace should promote a peaceful resolution of conflicts, transformation by building inter-ethnic groups, trust and confidence among ethnic groups and political parties, encourage and create a space for negotiation between national political groups, and engage in dialogue, mediation, and reconciliation between parties to achieve a nonviolent resolution and sustainable peace across the country. A nationwide, all-inclusive truth and reconciliation dialogue is necessary to address past grievances, allow closure, and stir the healing process among all Ethiopians. I hope the international community and the US government will assist Ethiopia in strengthening democracy, spur economic development, and advance peace and security. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Falaka, for this remarks. And now we look forward to listening from our fourth speaker, Mr. Yusuf Badawaza. So please go ahead and provide your remarks.
Thank you very much for the Institute of World Politics and the other partners that organized this important conversation on Ethiopia's current situation and trying and get insights on the way forward. I've been asked to make a few remarks on issues of human rights and political space. But I think as much as that is really important, and I would really like to limit my remarks to that. I think the backdrop of this conversation that we're having is truly a situation where Ethiopia found itself over the past few months, which is the war in Tigray. I think we cannot talk about human rights, political space, and the upcoming elections without that sad phenomenon being on the background, or rather even at the center of everything at this point, because of the sad reality that we are witnessing in terms of how it took back the country's progress in terms of people's and communities' relationship, and the massive humanitarian crisis that it is causing. So as much as I think we would like to move on with the business of politics and rebuilding the country, I think we need also to take time and examine how we got into this, and how a very promising political experiment that started in 2018 because of a sustained popular protest that forced an entrenched authoritarian regime like the EPRDF to make some concessions. So I would like to point to at least 2 points that I think led us to this sad war. I think one, in my view, is a legacy of the deeply authoritarian culture that the EPRDF established in terms of resolving differences. I think it is a failure on the part of political leaders to resolve differences through political process. I think that is one, I think, and also the other is a lack of a clear and agreed upon roadmap as to how the transition, that the very promising transition that started in 2018 was to be led. I think the different parties having different views on how the country should be moving forward in terms of detaching itself from decades of authoritarian rule and embarking on a democratic path also, in my view, contributed to how we ended up having to resolve differences, much of our differences through force, the use of force, and the worsening situation into our way of resolving our differences through a political process. I think, having said that, I think in terms of the human rights situation in the context of particularly the armed conflict, it's, I think, obvious that war claims lives, war causes emergency situations that in theory provides justifications for suppressing a lot of fundamental rights, and in particular in a political environment such as Ethiopia's, where the human rights situation has already been precarious. I think the fact that the emergency situation provided through because of this war and the different political and security challenges across the country seem to have aggravated the situation in which we begin to see a slight improvement in the human rights situation. I think it's important to list many of the human rights abuses that followed, specifically the armed conflict in Tigray, starting from the information and communication blackout imposed by the government, and also the other warring party has its own share in that, led to a deprivation of citizens of their right to get unfettered information, and led to a number of uninformed commentary from within and outside, based on sound bites and anecdotal stories about how what happened and how the parties to the war are behaving themselves. I think many of the human rights abuses have also been documented by none other than domestic human rights actors, including the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the Ethiopian Human Rights Council. The extrajudicial killings against ethnic members of ethnic minorities, the looting, the physical attacks are a few of these rights violations. I think it's important to document, investigate, and report on this, and also put records for future accountability. I think part of what we are witnessing now, part of the reasons for what we are witnessing now, to the fact that we are descending into conflict after conflict, is that we haven't really agreed upon on how we address past abuses, past serious human rights abuses. So this dilemma we're having between reconciliation and justice and peace, I think need also be addressed if we are going to avoid similar sad situations. In terms of the political space, again, as I've said at the outset, I think one of the probably the single most important political event in the country is going to be the elections this year. So the political space for that, I think, needs to be examined very closely in terms of whether or not all the parties to the elections, not just the political parties, the media, civil society, government, local and regional and federal entities, whether there is a readiness and the desire, and I think most importantly, whether or not citizens feel safe and optimistic about going to the polls, and have been, whether or not they have been offered real choices in terms of who their next leaders are going to be. So I think if you look at the many security challenges that we have in terms of targeted attacks on ethnic minorities in different parts of the country, the recurrent complaints of major political parties about their members and their leaders being in jail, I think need to be addressed. And I think another point is,
if we can move on, and then we can address just for the sake of time, and then we would address whatever you haven't in the Q&A section.
Okay, thank you.
Badawaza, for your very insightful remark. So our last but not least is Dr. Gideon. So Gideon, Dr. Gideon, as an Attorney General, please, if you can address some of the points raised by the panelists and just bring us up to speed on, as someone who is on the ground working for the government in Ethiopia, and you see things up close, so you can bring us up to speed and address some of the issues that have been highlighted by our four panelists. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairperson, and I'd also like to thank the organizers for organizing this important conversation and for putting up such a distinguished panel. So in the interest of time, I would try to avoid repetitions and try to address some of the matters I think we need to tackle. I mean, as far as the genesis of the conflict are concerned, I think that has been well addressed by some of the previous speakers, particularly Professor Abiy and Ms. Burton have, and Mr. Fellega also have addressed the genesis of the conflict. So I don't need to go into that. To reiterate, I would simply say that this is a tragic conflict that has been forced upon the Ethiopian people and the Ethiopian government. This is something that we try to avoid. The government has shown great restraint and patience with regard to the TPLF. We have tried to be as accommodative as possible, but the attack on the Northern Command was something that no one could tolerate, no self-respecting government could tolerate. So as far as the genesis is concerned, it's well laid out. I don't need to go further into the details. Now, in relation to that, something that I think is worth rectifying is when Mr. Yusuf was addressing human rights concern, he said that there is an information blackout that could be considered as a violation of an abuse of human rights. There are two important points to point out in this regard. First, as a matter of fact, by now it's well established that the attack on telecommunication infrastructure, power generating infrastructure were attacks carried out by the TPLF. This is something that could be verified later on by independent investigators and observers as well. TPLF operatives have been recorded by CCTV camera while they were sabotaging the telecom center in Meki. So the blackout in communication that we have seen in the Tigray regional state was not a blackout imposed by the federal government. Rather, it's a blackout that is the result of the attack on basic infrastructure carried out by the TPLF, and that is something that could be verified by all interested. Having addressed that, the other issue I think that is important to address is the issue of humanitarian assistance and access. In relation to that, it's a well-known fact that Tigray is one of the parts of Ethiopia where there is a great vulnerability for various reasons. I mean, it's part of the country that has been settled and cultivated for thousands of years. It's partly arid due to climate change, other factors as well. Even in ordinary times, there is a great deal of vulnerability. Now, there is no gainsaying that the conflict has exacerbated this situation, and there is a need to provide humanitarian assistance, humanitarian support. And the government is committed to providing this support for those in need, in partnership with the international community. In relation to this, I would like to call everyone's attention to the statement issued by the World Food Programme on the 6th of February 2021, just 2 days ago. I think that statement provides a very objective and a very fair assessment of the situation on the ground. The statement indicates that about 2.5 to 3 million people require emergency food assistance, and that it also indicates that the existing agreement between the United Nations and the government of Ethiopia to provide humanitarian access in Tigray is workable, and that what we need to do is to expand and intensify already existing efforts. That statement also indicates that the government and the international community in partnership have already provided food assistance to up to 1.7 million people who are in need of emergency food assistance. And our objective is, in cooperation with organizations like the World Food Programme and other partners, would like to expand access, would like to intensify and scale up the already existing efforts to provide support for those in need. There is already a joint platform, an emergency coordination committee, and would like to, as a matter of priority and urgency, push these efforts forward and ensure that everyone who needs humanitarian assistance and need will get that assistance and need. Now, this is as far as humanitarian assistance and need is concerned. Now, moving ahead, as far as the trajectory of the democratic reform and transition is concerned, I mean, it's obvious that the reform process is a reform process that has faced many challenges and ups and downs. Anyone would expect there to be a linear and smooth transition from autocracy to democracy in a context like Ethiopia. That would be a very naive expectation. Given our political culture, the prevalence of ethnic division, and the division and animosity that has been sown in the past, as well as the prevalence of poverty and youth unemployment, it's obvious that any transition to democracy in a country like Ethiopia would face huge challenge. I would say that despite this challenge, the reform process has not been derailed. It's still on course despite the challenge. And I'll try to provide evidence for this assertion. The democratic institutions that have been restructured, reestablished as part of the reform process have shown great level of autonomy and independence, and that's something that we are seeing even now. I'm particularly referring to the National Electoral Board and the National Human Rights Commission. If you see the reports and statements issued by the Human Rights Commission, as well as the conduct of the Electoral Board in the past few months, there is no doubt that these institutions are showing great autonomy and independence. For example, the National Electoral Board has recently issued a very stern statement against the ruling party, warning it for reprimanding it for conduct the National Electoral Board thought was in contravention with the appropriate code of conduct. You could also see statements and reports issued by the Human Rights Commission. These are reports and statements that do not necessarily cast the government in favorable light. In addition to the autonomy and independence shown by these institutions, if you look at political and media pluralism, there has never been this level of pluralism among the media and political parties in Ethiopia in our history. This is unprecedented. And the passage of the new media proclamation adopted within a framework that was very transparent, participatory, and inclusive, a process in which media practitioners and experts and human rights advocates had a leading role to play. I mean, we can see that in terms of space and freedom for the media, for political parties, we're still making progress, while there is a lot that needs to be done. As far as civil society is concerned, there is a vibrant civil society. The legislative and institutional reforms that we have put in place 2 years ago are bearing fruit, and that is obvious for everyone to see. And most importantly, I would say that despite several shocks that and several crises that we have to face and overcome, the Ethiopian state, I'm not simply talking about the government, but I'm talking about the Ethiopian state as a political community, has shown great resilience, and that, I would say, inspires confidence that we are in a position to turn a corner. We expect the June 2021 election to be a huge milestone in our democratic reform process. We expect that it would provide further impetus and momentum for further reforms that we need to undertake. So yes, there is a long way to go. We are facing lots of challenges, many obstacles, but there is the determination and commitment both on the part of the government and Ethiopians as a whole to build an inclusive, democratic, and pluralistic society. And I'm optimistic that despite the challenge, we will be able to accomplish that. In the interest of time, I'll stop my remarks here and I'll address any other issue during the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Attorney General, for this comprehensive statement on the state of affairs in Ethiopia, and also addressing some of the points that have been brought up by Badawaza, and we can get into the Q&A. So please, for the audience out there, send your questions to our inbox so we can ask them in the webinar. So please, feel free to send your questions in. So with that, we will open it up for a Q&A. I got a bunch of questions here, so I would call on a specific panelist to address a question that is directed to you, and then others also can feel free. If you have something to say, you can say it for sure. So the first question goes to Dr. Abnek. The question is, what is the evidence that Eritrean troops are in Ethiopia? Even if it were true, wouldn't the government of Ethiopia said if it is not open, if it's not upon its approval? So I believe the question is talking about the troops in Eritrea, if I got this question correctly. So why don't you go ahead, Dr. Abnek?
Yeah, Well, yeah, it's a thorny issue, but the Northern Command General Belay Sayoum has said there are Eritrean troops in Tigray, and we didn't want to, but they are there, and they should preferably leave. Secondly, there is a report by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, the government-supported human rights watchdog, which has said on credible evidence from witnesses in the field in Tigray that they have seen Eritrean troops and they have been doing the wrong things. So we cannot doubt that there are troops active there. But of course, we have to also keep in mind that there are also parts of the TPLF dressed up in Eritrean army uniforms, it seems, also on equally credible evidence, which have been engaged in strange things as well and have been also obfuscating the situation. But we should not doubt that, but we also should not think that it's totally, it's just surprising that the Eritreans have been drawn into this conflict. But the point is now that having noticed this presence of the Eritreans, they should really be enticed, I think, to move out and not to further complicate the situation, which I think is a task of the federal government and the federal army to stimulate. So I think there is, if you scan the sources, there was this presence, and the presence is traumatic and has to be ended.
Thank you. Any of the other panelists would like to address this? Hello? Okay, so the next question is directed to Ms. Bronwyn. The question is, how should we assess the recent statements and actions of the new Biden administration vis-a-vis Ethiopia, the conflict in Tigray, the Ethiopian Reform Initiative? So why don't you go ahead, Ms.
Sure. So the U.S. response to Ethiopia has always been confused, I think. On the one hand, the United States has always been deeply concerned with the human rights situation and with democratic abuses that were prevalent under the former EPRDF, TPLF-led regime. Those concerns have continued. But now, as then, there are competing worries about maintaining a good relationship with Ethiopia, in particular because Ethiopia has been the backbone of U.S. counterterrorism efforts in the Horn of Africa, and because Ethiopia is perceived as the bulwark of stability in the very troubled Horn of Africa region. So there's always been a push-pull where the U.S. officials always want to criticize human rights abuses, and they always wanted to criticize the failure of democratic processes in Ethiopia. But they also are very afraid of pushing Ethiopia on a path towards instability, and they're very afraid of upending the good relations with the Ethiopian government. Obviously, there was a great amount of optimism when Prime Minister Abiy came into office, and there's been great enthusiasm for the reforms. But I think there has not been a consistent response by various actors in the US administration. And what you're seeing is people erring on one side or the other of this push-pull that I've been describing. I hope with the Biden administration coming into office and with the appointment of key actors, there will be more consistency and in particular, more attention given to this issue. It's been a big problem that personally, I think the way that the government has responded to the crisis in Tigray has depended on who the person speaking is, whether it's Tibor or Godak or someone else. And so I hope we'll see more institutionalization, but I wouldn't blame anybody for being confused because so far, my view is it's been a bit of a muddle on the US side.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Any other takers for this question? If you want to add to it, Ms. Bronwyn has said. Okay, thank you. We're moving on to the following question, and the following question is directed to Yusuf. The question is, could you provide proof that government destroyed communications infrastructure?
I think I was also talking about the not just the infrastructure the restrictions and the ban on internet and telephone communications. I was also talking about the right to access and impart information, and being the region a war zone, it has been restricted to international and domestic media largely. So the major narrative we have been hearing about what was going on since November 3rd was from government media outlets, and on the other hand, TPLF-controlled media groups at the start of the war until the time that they were not able to broadcast largely. But I think to put this question of who does what and when to bed, I think there needs to be more access to independent reporting, be it international or domestic, instead of just expecting everyone to take stories from the warring parties without scrutiny. I think that is the point I would like to underline, and the fact that infrastructure was destroyed by the TPLF. There have been, I've seen CCTV, what was called by the Ethiopian Telecommunications Corporation as CCTV footage regarding how and when these infrastructures were sabotaged and destroyed. I think that there is no way to actively dispute or prove that. But I think even if we take that for granted, there needs to be more transparency on the part of the government, so that all these recurring questions of independent information coming out from the area and frankly from all around Ethiopia needs to be addressed.
Well, thank you so much for your clarification. Mr. Attorney General, would you like to add more information as far as what Mr. Badawaza have brought up, that the there need to be access to the either local or international media, and whether that's the case from your vantage point of view, being on the ground working for the government?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. I understand Mr. Yusuf's concern, and I understand where he's coming from a human rights perspective, calling for access for journalists. In relation to this, there have been local journalists, independent journalists, who have been able to access the region state. There are daily flights now, they can go there. They have done some reporting. But in relation to this, I think it's also important to remember the fact that there is a state of emergency, and within a context of state of emergency, freedoms like freedom of expression, freedom of movement could be temporarily derogated. So it is within this context that there are some restrictions, but we're doing everything within our power to ensure that the security situation will be improved and that there will be increased access as we go along.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Anyone want to add comment to that? We're moving on to the following question, and this is directed to Dr. Abnick. The question is, or the questioner is asking, what is your assessment of the European position to suspend development assistance to Ethiopia? And also, what is required to reverse the heavy-handed response now that the humanitarian assistance is being scaled up, do you see the EU position being reversed quickly, as someone who specialized in the Horn of Africa?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just answered this question in the chat, also typing in my answer, but I cannot kind of elaborate on it a bit. I think it's a very unfortunate decision from the EU to immediately install a ban on providing aid, already promised aid. I mean, I regret to say that our Minister of Development Cooperation and Foreign Affairs here in Holland, in the Netherlands, was one of the first to do that, just based on superficial, incomplete media reports and certain contacts which were not properly checked. So I think this is really unfortunate. No one is held by this kind of ban on aid money, because least of all people in Tigray. So I really don't understand why they would have the illusion here in Europe that this kind of sanction would help anybody. I'm not sure that it will be quickly reversed. They will now start discussion, deliberations. What is reliable information? What is lies? What is this? What is that? But I think they should really engage more in getting the facts, doing their homework, also dialogue with the Ethiopian government, weighing all the evidence, and be skeptical about all the avalanche of strange press reports, and reconsider that decision. And maybe in a kind of new supervision structure where the aid is properly distributed and checked where it is going and so forth. But I think a lot is possible with what is now in place in Tigray, and the EU should ultimately and quickly reconsider its position.
Well, thank you so much. The next question is directed to, I think this question is to the Attorney General. So the question is, let me read this question quickly here. Okay, so the question is about students who have been kidnapped, I believe. So this is allegations of that Ethiopian people want to hear from you about what happened to the kidnapped college students and why are the Amhara people massacred?
I think let me start by challenging the very premise of the question. I would say that in the past few years there have been conflicts that have been instigated and sponsored by various actors, including the TPLF. And as a result of these conflicts, ethnic minorities in various parts of the country, not just belonging to one particular ethnic group, but to different ethnic groups, have been attacked. Whenever those kind of attacks have occurred, the federal government has intervened and tried to hold those responsible for these kind of attacks accountable. So this is a tragic legacy of the division and chaos that has been institutionalized, that has been pushed, deliberately pushed by some actors. But this is a challenge within the transition that we are trying to tackle. And I think this is all that I should say on this topic at this point in time. Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you. Mr. Falaka, we're going to bring you in here to, the question is on whether, there's a mention here of whether the South African Truth and Reconciliation experience offer in the way of best practice and things to maybe help us in this conflict in Ethiopia. So as someone who have studied in conflict resolutions, if you can shed more light on that, and if any other of the panelists also want to add, please feel free.
Yes, I think that's one of my favorite model. Going back to Nelson Mandela in the past said, we don't solve our issues by talking to our friends, but we solve our issues by talking to our enemies and people we're in conflict with. With that premises, the South African Truth and Reconciliation model was a great model, and I think Ethiopia has the opportunity to kind of create that type of all-inclusive, across-the-board that helps participate, bring in religious leaders, political leaders, young leaders on the ground, and having that truth conversation about past grievances and where we go from now. I think the problem that we see in our political narrative is that we just stuck in the past, stuck in ideology of 16th century of tribalism and ethnicism, and we need to bring in our youth who are represent 70% of the Ethiopian population into the 21st century. We should be talking about how we can coexist together, how we can stimulate our economy, bring Ethiopia out of poverty, and help bring in better relationship among our neighbors. The fact that we're stuck in a 16th century type of dilemma or dialogue is sad, but it's time that we all have a frank and truth conversation about the future Ethiopia and lead next generation to the 21st century. We should be talking about economic development, providing jobs and security for our youth instead of fighting about ethnic differences, which to some extent are really socially constructed. And it is important that to have that truth and reconciliation dialogue move forward. I think we never had any type of closure in the past about our different grievances that we have, and having that closure and facing the facts and the truth and moving forward is critical for the future of Ethiopia.
Terrific. So this is a good segue to pivot on that truth and reconciliation, but also with your neighbors. And so the question here I have is, what is the role of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam in the current conflict, but also to the point that Ms. Bronwyn brought up about the U.S. administration. So what is the U.S. administration role going to be going forward vis-a-vis Ethiopia, Egypt, Sudan tensions or regional conflict? But also if you can address to that same line of question, the border issues with Sudan. So I believe I will let the Attorney General go first, followed by Ms. Bronwyn, and then Mr. Falaka, you can also answer the question. So go ahead, please.
I'd rather pass this question.
Okay, sure. So can you go ahead, Ms. Bronwyn, and answer?
Thank you. So the border dispute between Sudan and Ethiopia, and also the concerns about the GERD, which obviously involves Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia as well. These are difficult questions, which fundamentally need to be resolved through dialogue between the parties themselves. I think it's my sincere hope that the Biden administration will take a more constructive approach to the GERD than that adopted by the Trump administration. I think that President Trump himself poured oil on this conflict through his irresponsible comments about the potential for Egypt to bomb the GERD. Many rightfully regarded those statements as an invitation to Egypt to take kinetic actions, which certainly the Biden administration would not support. So again, it's early days for the Biden administration, and I think that, in my view, there is some question about whether the United States would be the right party to play a mediating role in this, given its past statements and past positioning. But I would hope that it would be possible. Again, I think that there's some cleaning up that needs to be done by President Biden's new team. But I think certainly the willingness to engage is there.
Thank you. Mr. Falaka.
I go back to the African solution for African problems. And yes, it's important to, as independent mediator, the international community impartially can participate and help or assist on the negotiation efforts. However, we Africans need to solve our problems diplomatically by negotiation and talking through. We have to come. I mean, we have to face reality. Come in terms of helping not only Ethiopia. The entire region needs to develop economically. If we don't advance economically, develop and provide jobs for our youth, we will be in a cycle of conflict for the next 100 years. So our leaders and our community must come to that understanding. And I believe we can solve the issue by talking, by diplomacy. And it's time. The time has come that we need to lift our respective countries out of poverty. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The next question is directed to the Attorney General, Dr. Gideon. The question is, what is the Ethiopian government doing to provide fact-based, frequent public updates about the internal and external conflicts and challenges that are facing Ethiopia? I think you mentioned a couple of them, but if you can elaborate more based on the question.
Okay, so I think the question is what the government is doing to update and to provide information update for those interested regarding conflict. Let me start by considering the fact that I don't believe that we have done enough in terms of communicating, in terms of making our case and providing sufficient updates, both for the particularly for the international community. I mean, you could attribute this to a number of factors. Ethiopians, by and large, tend to be shy, very reserved, sometimes hoping that the facts would speak for themselves. But this has exposed us to a barrage of disinformation, which had been quite detrimental to our national interest. There have been initial attempts to have a dedicated fact check, social media posts, and to provide daily briefings for the international media outlets. We need to revitalize those efforts. These kind of conversations are very important and helpful in that regard. And the engagement of Ethiopians in the diaspora, Ethiopians living in Ethiopia as well, to provide updates and information and perspective is very important. So both the government and the friends of Ethiopia and Ethiopians as well need to do more, and this is something that I would rather concede. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Mr. Badawaza, in your remark, you spoke about the culture of authoritarianism in Ethiopia, but also by way of saying that Ethiopia need to do better in terms of resolving the differences and the views, and that has contributed to what Dr. Gideon is talking about. How do you bring about this culture of transparency, but also just keeping the public in the loop?
Thank you. I think, as Dr. Gideon just mentioned, that there seemed to be a belief on the part of the different government entities that as long as they do good, as long as they have the truth in their side, there does not need to be any need to communicate that. I think in this information age, I think as much as the substantive delivery on policy is crucial, I think the ability to communicate that to citizens and to other audiences is also important. I think it's not just in the context of the current elections. I think there has been some serious limitations on the part of the government in terms of putting in place a public-facing communication strategy to talk about the very remarkable, particularly in the beginning, reform measures that the government has been taking. So that, I think, created a very big void in terms of how citizens understand where this political transition is going and how it affects their daily lives. I think there is no denying that particularly the first few months of the political transition were really dynamic and promising. But I think that the aspect of communications and engaging the stakeholders, including citizens, was very sorely missed. I think there is a lot of work that need to be done in that regard. I think that culture of not having this public-facing way of doing communication also is reflected in the current crisis, and also even though that does not replace the need for independent verification, I think at this point, whether we like it or not, there seems to be the expectation that the government seems to have the information, but for one reason or another is not sharing them widely. I think that's a limitation. Going back to, I think, the political culture, I think I was talking about this being a transition, and the old system, the old habits of doing things are still in place. The institutions are more or less in place. Most importantly, the mindset that EPRDF established in terms of the opacity of doing things, the very close-kept nature of information and strategies is still affecting the way that government is doing things. I think this also raises the question that who, even within the government, believes that they are 100% on board to an open, democratic, and transparent system of government. I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of not just reforming the institution, but working on the mindset of members of the government itself. And I think one last point in this regard is the elections. I think we have seen a snapshot of how reformed institutions could deliver promising prospects by looking at the National Electoral Board of Ethiopia, the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, and I think these are efforts that need to be replicated elsewhere. I think the election management, as we all know, is not the beginning and the end of elections, but I think that aspect of the elections so far by the NEB needs to be acknowledged. But I think, as I said, most importantly, it is creating the level playing field, and it is about securing the confidence of citizens and the ability to instill confidence and safety among voters that would make both the lead up to the elections and the elections itself, and also avoiding post-election violence.
Thank you so much for this extensive answer. If I may bring in Ms. Bronwyn on this. Yeah, you, I think in your remarks before, you wanted the conflict, or at least the discussion, to be focused and centered on probably maybe you wanted it on the elections, if I remember correctly. So if you can elaborate more on what do you think what is this diverting, the conflict in the Tigray region, what is it diverting us away from, and what do you want us to do? in light of what this question is insinuating, what Badawaza has answered in terms of the upcoming elections?
I think that there's a very unfortunate there's a very unfortunate sinkhole that we've fallen into here, where because there has been a delay, and perhaps an unreasonable delay, by the Ethiopian government in providing access to parts of Tigray, it has created an opening for TPLF affiliated media networks and individuals to launch claims against the government that many people would consider to be exaggerated. And because it's been impossible to go into Tigray to a large degree to verify whether these claims are true or false, it's created a sense of intense worry in the international community, a fear that a genocide could be taking place, a fear that war crimes could be taking place. And the kind of simple verification that would disprove these allegations has not been possible. And that's pushing us in a direction, a terrible and dangerous direction, frankly, where very well-intentioned members of the US government in Europe are asking themselves whether they have a moral obligation to consider sanctions on Ethiopia, to consider bringing charges at the ICC against members of the Ethiopian government. And my view is that not only is this unnecessary, but it's deeply damaging to Ethiopia's prospects moving forward. Because once you're on that path of sanctions, for example, it's very, very difficult to go back. Once a government has a cloud hanging over its head, it's hard for that cloud to disappear. No matter how many times we gather in forums like this to talk about, rightfully, the terrible legacy that the Ethiopian government, the current Ethiopian government, is trying to repair, the legacy of ethnic segregation and repression. I mean, these are very valid points, but all of these conversations are going to be deferred as long as the focus is on this humanitarian crisis in the north. I'm very glad to hear of the new agreement that's been struck with WFP that will facilitate entry into Tigray. I really hope that that will help to dispel some of the worst fears. And I also hope that the sense that the Ethiopian government is really cooperating wholeheartedly with efforts to illuminate what's going on in the north will do a great deal to dispel these fears by Western policymakers, because Ethiopia is on the verge of a tremendous historical moment. The elections that are scheduled for June will make or break the transition. And I think that there are real questions about whether June is the right time to hold those elections. Those questions have been raised by opposition parties in Ethiopia. And as long as the international community is focused on what's happening in the north, they are not engaging on questions of the election, whether they should be pushing for postponement, whether they should be deploying more and more resources to support the election so it can go forward credibly in June. These are the issues that are fundamentally going to shape Ethiopia's trajectory for the next decade or more. And we're not dealing with them right now because of the inability to just get up there in the north and find out what's going on and do what has to be done. And that's tragic. And to be honest with you, I think it benefits nobody more than the old TPLF leaders themselves, because they are, again, the focus of all of the attention. And that doesn't serve anybody. And so we all need to cooperate to make sure that we get past this moment and start concentrating on what is unquestionably more important.
Thank you so much. Dr. Gideon, what do you say to what Ms. Bronwyn has brought up? You've answered the part that has to do with the opening up with the WF on January 6th, which is a good sign, I guess. But what do you say to the second part as far as the election being held on time? What is Ethiopia doing from your vantage point of view, working with the government?
As far as the timing of the election is concerned, I think it's it's something that most political actors in Ethiopia agree that there is a need to hold the election at this point in time. It already had to be postponed for a year due to COVID-19. That was to some extent already controversial. The National Electoral Board has undertaken the necessary preparation to conduct the election on time, and it's a widely anticipated election. In most parts of the country, we can't conduct the election without any serious security or logistical issues. There could be pockets where it could be difficult to have it. There might be some snags here and there, but by and large, we think it's a very important milestone for the transition process. It's democracy is not all about elections, but to tackle the very critical reform agendas we need to tackle, there needs to be a broader mandate, a clearer mandate, and having this election in June would be very critical. So I think it's important to go ahead with it. It's not only a constitutional or legal requirement that we hold it then, but it's also something that most Ethiopians want to have it, get it over with, and move on to different issues. I mean, there is the economy. When talking about the conflict, when talking about the election, we also have to remember that the economy and other issues need serious attention. And in order to tackle those, I think we need to put this behind us.
Thank you so much. I would like to bring in Dr. Abnick into the discussion. The next question is about, do you think Ethiopia's system of ethnic federalism should be dismantled and replaced with a new system of organizing regions that is not based on ethnicity? As long as ethnic federalism does exist, how should regional governments dominated by one ethnic group protect ethnic minorities living within their borders? And also, how can these regional governments make the minorities feel like they are as citizens, that they are protected? And also, if you can, Mr. Falka, if you can also chime in with Badawaza following third, so that would be good. So please go ahead, Dr. Abnick. Hello, Dr. Abnick. Seems like Dr. Abnick has some.
Sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
This is the question, the crucial question, of course, right? Much discussed in the past 20 years. I have no clear answer. I mean, I see the advantages historically of recognizing ethnicity, recognizing suppressed cultural ethnic groups, ethno-regional groups, which had no proper say, which had no access to state structures. I see the emancipatory effect of that. But unfortunately, it has been used in callous ways in the past 27, 28 years. And it has contravened constitutional premises. It has contravened economic equality. And it has also led, as I said in my introduction, to an undue territorialization of ethnicity, excluding groups which do not really feel or have a territorial bond with a so-called ethnic homeland, which is about maybe 25% of the Ethiopian population in cities and so forth. They are diffuse in their orientation on a certain ethnic tradition or ethnic group or country. So there is this positive heritage, but there is also the effect, the practical effect of ethnic federalism working sometimes against economic and political processes in the country as a whole, in terms of full democratization, in terms of full economic participatory access to state resources and so forth. So I have no answer to what to do. I think there is no prospect of really totally reforming and getting rid of ethnic-based federalism, but I think a cautious way towards rethinking the structure as it is would be good. I mean, I think the Prime Minister has talked about that. As I said in my talk in the beginning, he did not question the Constitution and he did not attack ethnic federalism as such, but he wants to capitalize on the possibilities that structure offers for cooperation and synergy. That is, I think, a way forward, the way forward, to draw richness from diversity, like some other countries have done. In a way, Ethiopia is unique, and in the sense of having politicized ethnicity in an era where the idea itself is less and less popular. Look at Tanzania, look at Ghana. There is no such politicization of ethnicity. So it has to be rethought, I think. And also there are such waves of studies made on ethnic federalism by foreign academics, but also increasingly by a huge number of Ethiopian scholars, which are moving in the same direction, trying to rethink the positive aspects of it, but trying to ultimately also, reform it in a way which enhances cooperation. I think that's the way forward. So a blanket cancellation of ethnic federalism will not be in the books, but a rethinking and an optimization of what it can offer Ethiopian population as a whole, as a nation, is certainly in order.
Okay, thank you so much. Mr. Falaka, what do you think?
Yeah, I think Dr. Abnikaster did a great explanation of it. But what I think in terms of ethnic federalism is a very tricky question. We should recognize and provide political and economic access to all ethnic groups in Ethiopia. But however, we have over 80 ethnic groups in Ethiopia, and creating a state structure based on ethnicity makes it difficult for economic and political participation. Recognizing the languages, the culture, and bringing all ethnic groups and accepting the humanity of it, very, very critical. But creating a political parties and system based on ethnicity is making it more complicated and difficult to implement. And the other, I think, what a lot of people miss is someone like me who has multi-ethnic background. Where do we fit in the system? I think I believe that's the silent majority. There's a lot of Ethiopians who have multi-ethnic backgrounds, and they don't have a place in that structure. So that's something to think about when we're talking about ethnic federalism. I think federalism system is good, but however, creating a political system and a structure based on ethnicity might not yield the result that we want. To put it in a perspective, take the United States and imagine if you divided Caucasians, Black, Hispanic, and Asian states. How does that work in terms of movement, economic activity, political activity? It creates more division and friction than bringing positive light.
Okay. Dr. Badawaza, if you can briefly comment on this, and then we'll move on. We're running out of time. There are still a lot of questions, so please.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with both Professor Ebnik and Basu. I think there is no denying that there are significant changes that were introduced since the adoption of the federal constitution in '95. I think I don't think that there is a way of going back from that in terms of duly recognizing each and every ethnic community in Ethiopia. I think that the problem is when ethnicity becomes the major point of political organization. I think if any revisitation of this constitutional structure is to do, I think should focus primarily on mitigating the effects of ethnic politicization of ethnicity, which is easier said than done. But I think I agree with the fact that there needs to be a close look at the current political structure, i.e. the constitution, with Ethiopians having an elected government that has the support of a broader constituency for them to embark on a constitutional reform process.
Thank you so much. Our next question, and then we would try to conclude. So our next question is, why isn't there any discussion in the international media and interest groups about the genocide committed in Meki, currently in the Tigray region, against the ethnic Amharas? So if you can, Attorney General, please, if you can take that question, and followed by Ms. Bronwyn, and then we would try to conclude after that. Thank you.
As far as why the international community is not saying more about that, why that's not a topic of conversation, I mean, it's very difficult for me to comment about that. I'd just like to point out the fact that we have the relevant authorities have concluded their investigation of the atrocities committed in Meki. There was a fact-finding mission, a human rights investigation conducted by the Human Rights Commission. Separate from that, there has been also a criminal investigation by law enforcement agencies. That investigation has already been concluded, and we expect charges to be pressed in the coming few weeks. But as far as the international community's silence on this topic is concerned, it's a puzzle for me as well. So I can't really explain it. So I'll defer to the other panelists.
Okay, thank you so much. Anyone want to add to this? Otherwise, we're moving on. Ms. Bronwyn, it's your turn.
I would express my deep consternation that the massacre at Meki has not received more international press attention, and more than that, that the continuing assaults on the Amhara community have not provoked a level of outrage and attention that is assuredly merited. I think part of the reason for that is that the Western press tends to work with narratives, and all of the articles that have been written thus far about this conflict have focused on the potential for the Tigrayan minority to experience genocide at the hands of Amhara and federal troops, and potentially Eritrean troops as well. And that makes it very difficult for members of the press to deviate from that line. It would be very helpful for some international media organizations to take a step back and talk about how the TPLF had in fact been an authoritarian regime, and that they entered this conflict with what most people assumed was a fairly pronounced military advantage. That this is really has been a military conflict of equals, it was assumed. But without that underlying set of facts having been established, I think it's very difficult for the press to think about how to incorporate the Amhara and other atrocities that are taking place.
Thank you so much for your remarks, and thank you so much to our panels. I would like to bring in someone who has been very helpful in bringing us together and bringing all of you, the panelists, and without which we could not have had the event. Gannett Nguzi is, please welcome and say a couple words, and we'll conclude after this.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. First and foremost, I would like to thank Florindo from Friends of Angola for suggesting to have this forum, and Professor Hashem for his willingness to organize this event, and Bessu for helping with organizing, and of course the panelists for accepting our invitations. We co-sponsored this webinar because there's so much misunderstanding of the current situation in Ethiopia. We wanted to help the public to have a clearer understanding. I hope the experts in our panels clarify some of the misinformation that's dominating the media. Please feel free to email Professor Hashem or myself with any questions you have with this. We conclude the event. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Gannett. Thank you so much, our panelists, for your time and for your great and very actively and lively event. There's still more questions to be answered, so we just don't have eternity of time to answer them. I will encourage the audience to send the email, questions to be answered. So maybe we could still follow up with you, and maybe you can answer the questions in a later time. So thank you so much for tuning in to our amazing guests on Facebook, YouTube, and we'll look forward to having you in future series of this African Strategic Forum, bringing thoughtful leaders just like we've had today. So thank you so much. It has been my honor to moderate and coordinate. Thank you.